Yes, guys, welcome to the next lesson. So, in this lesson, we're going to be building up upon everything we've learned about interest rates and GDP, but it's going to be a lot more in depth and understand the different types of interest rates and GDP, of course. So, we're going to be looking at interest rates first and then obviously translate that into GDP. So, the real interest rate is what you're going to be hearing a lot in the news. This is what a lot of economists use, especially in their data. So the real interest rate accounts for inflation, given a more precise reading of a borrower's buying power after the position has been redeemed. Nominal interest rate. The nominal interest rate or coupon rate is the actual price borrowers pay lenders without accounting for any other economic factors. And then the effective interest rate is it includes the impact of compounding, in which a bond might pay interest annually but compounds semi-annually, increasing the overall return. So this might sound a bit confusing at first, and of course, it was like that for me as well when I was originally learning about these things. But just to put it into context, so the real interest rate, think of it like this. Imagine a bond has a 10% nominal yield, but the inflation rate is 2.5%. Then you have a bond that has a real interest rate of only 7.5%. So what does this mean? That bond, on the face value, it says that that bond is going to increase by 10% year on year, or whenever it says it by, whether it be 30 years, whatever it may be. So it says 10%, but let's just say it's 10% within 1 year. However, due to the economic, you know, the economy at the time, inflation in that year was 2.5%. So what does that mean? That means although your bond has increased in value by 10%, and that's what you'd be paid back, the actual purchasing power of that isn't the 10% that you would have seen last year. It's actually only 7.5%. So if we were to put that into an equation, the real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. So the nominal interest rate is the one that you see on face value. That's the front cover, let's just say, of the bond. The interest rate, the inflation rate is of course how much prices valued or devalued in that year. So why do investors care about the real interest rate? Investors will make smart assumptions to understand if the investment into the bond for is actually worth it, and if it will make a good return on investment through the calculation of the real interest rate. Now let's look at the two different conditions where you would actually consider buying that bond. So in a deflationary condition, inflation is a lot lower, therefore higher real rates, so it's a good investment. Let's look back at this equation. If inflation is lower, that means, there we go. If inflation is lower and you're calculating the real interest rate, let's just keep this standard. That means that you're going to have a higher real interest rate. Therefore, it's good to invest into that bond. However, if you're in an inflationary condition, that means inflation is obviously higher. Therefore, you get a lower real rate. So look for a better investment elsewhere. Obviously, looking back at that as well, that means if inflation rate is higher, that means that the real interest rate reduces in price. Of course, like like we mentioned previously, bonds are quite attractive when there's deflation occurring. That means interest rates are increasing. So in case you are struggling to grasp the concept, because it can be a bit complicated at first, let's just use the example that I'm going to be going through. You buy a bond, and on its front cover, it says that this bond will mature 5% a year. So you buy this bond at $100,000, which will expire in the listed amount of years. Let's say after 1 year, it's now worth $105,000. But think about it, is it really? You need to look at how much inflation has gone up by to understand your purchasing power. Now, because of this, it will affect your purchasing power, of course. The money you have may not be able to buy as much as it did before. Let's just say inflation went up to by 3% that year. That means in actuality, your $105,000 is actually can only buy $103,000 of products from the previous year. Now, this is why we look at interest rates, real interest rates, to get a proper understanding of how much we can actually make from the interest. It's the same concept as GDP data. So you've got real GDP data and then you've got the nominal GDP data. Of course, when it comes to GDP, you're talking about gross domestic product. That's the productivity of an economy. Um, so now an economy might to flaunt and say, oh yes, our GDP has increased. They'll look at nominal because they'll say, oh yes, this is how much has increased without factoring in inflation. But in reality, it's the same thing as what we've just seen with the interest rates. The real GDP data actually factors in that inflation and shows the true increase that we've seen in GDP that year. So, guys, please take notes, as particularly this lesson, this example right here. I really hope this does break it down for you and actually makes you understand why most economists actually look at just the real interest rate rather than the nominal interest rate. So, guys, take care and I'll see you in the next video.